For hundreds of years, people across Ireland have whispered about a strange group hiding in plain sight. Dark-haired, dark-eyed people living among a population known for red hair, freckles, and pale skin. Locals called them the Black Irish, and nobody could agree on where they came from. Some said they were descendants of shipwrecked Spanish sailors. Some said they carried the blood of ancient traders from the Mediterranean. Some even said they were a separate tribe that predated every other group on the island. For generations, this stayed a folk legend, a story told in pubs and passed down through families with no real proof behind it. Then geneticists finally decided to test the DNA. They pulled genetic samples from across Ireland, compared them against ancient burial sites, cross-referenced historical records, and ran the kind of analysis that can trace a bloodline back thousands of years. What they found did not just settle the argument, it rewrote the entire story of who the Irish actually are. If you enjoy deep dives into hidden history and human origins, stick around, because this one gets stranger the further you go. Now let's get into what the data actually showed. The term Black Irish has been used loosely for centuries, and that looseness is part of the problem. In different regions of Ireland, it meant different things. In some counties, it referred to families with unusually dark hair and eyes living in a sea of red-haired, fair-skinned neighbors. In other places, it was used for people believed to descend from foreign sailors who washed ashore after a shipwreck. In America, among Irish immigrant communities, the phrase sometimes got applied to entire branches of a family tree without much consistency at all. There was never one agreed definition, which made it almost impossible to study scientifically. You cannot run a genetic test on a term that means 5 different things, depending on who you ask, so before scientists could even begin comparing DNA, they had to decide what they were actually looking for. Was this a real ancestral group with a distinct genetic signature, or was it simply normal human variation that got mythologized over time because people love a good origin story? To answer that, researchers needed 3 things. They needed modern DNA samples from people across Ireland who identified as having this dark-featured ancestry. They needed ancient DNA pulled from burial sites and old bones scattered across the island. And they needed a way to compare both sets against the rest of Europe to see if anything genetically unusual actually showed up. The most popular explanation for the Black Irish, the one repeated in pubs and family stories for generations, involves the Spanish Armada. In 1588, Spain sent a massive fleet to invade England. The invasion failed, and on the journey home, storms wrecked dozens of Spanish ships along the rocky coastline of Ireland. Survivors who made it to shore were said to have settled among the local population, married into Irish families, and left behind a genetic trace that shows up generations later as darker hair and eyes. It's a romantic story. Shipwrecked sailors finding refuge on a foreign coast, starting new lives, blending into a new culture. The only problem is that when scientists actually looked at the numbers, the story falls apart almost immediately. Historical records show that the vast majority of Armada survivors who reached Ireland were killed, either by English forces hunting them down or by local lords following orders to eliminate them. The number of Spanish sailors who actually settled permanently and had surviving children in Ireland was small, likely only a few hundred at most, spread across a population of hundreds of thousands. Even in a best-case scenario where every single survivor successfully integrated and had children, the genetic contribution to the overall Irish population over 400 years would be so diluted it would barely register in a DNA test today. When researchers ran the numbers, the math simply did not support the legend. A few hundred sailors, 4 centuries ago, cannot explain a distinct, dark-featured population showing up across multiple counties in Ireland. So if the Spanish Armada story does not hold up, where does the actual dark hair and dark eyes come from? This is where the genetic data got interesting, because the answer turned out to be older, stranger, and far more revealing than a shipwreck legend. Ancient DNA extracted from Irish burial sites tells a very different story than most people expect. The earliest known inhabitants of Ireland, hunter-gatherers who lived on the island roughly 10,000 years ago, did not look like the Ireland we imagine today. Genetic analysis of their remains shows they overwhelmingly carried genes for dark skin, dark hair, and strikingly blue eyes. This combination sounds unusual today because we associate blue eyes with pale skin, but genetically the 2 traits evolved on separate timelines through separate mutations. The gene for blue eyes appeared and spread across parts of Europe before the genes for very pale skin became widespread. So the earliest people walking the hills of Ireland had a look that would seem strange to us now, dark complexion paired with light-colored eyes. Then, around 6,000 years ago, a wave of farmers arrived in Ireland from the region of modern-day Turkey, moving gradually through the Mediterranean and up into Western Europe over thousands of years before finally reaching the island. These farmers carried different genetic markers than the hunter-gatherers already living there, and when the 2 groups mixed, they produced a new blended population. This wasn't a clean replacement. It was centuries of interaction, intermarriage, and slow genetic merging. After the farmers came another wave, and this one changed Ireland's genetic makeup more than any single migration before it. Around 4,500 years ago, a population known to researchers as the Bell Beaker people arrived, carrying ancestry that traced back to the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. The steppe ancestry brought new genetic material into Ireland, including variants linked to lighter skin and different hair pigmentation. Genetic studies show that Bell Beaker ancestry replaced somewhere between 80 and 90% of the existing gene pool in Britain and Ireland within just a few centuries, an astonishingly fast and thorough genetic turnover for the ancient world. So by the time you reach what most people think of as ancient Ireland, the population had already been through at least 3 major genetic transformations: hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe pastoralists, each layering new traits and new variation on top of the last. And this is before you even get to the later historical waves that most people do know about: the Celtic influence arriving from continental Europe, Viking settlers establishing coastal trading towns starting in the 8th century, and Norman invaders arriving in the 12th century who brought their own genetic contributions from France and beyond. Every single one of these waves left genetic fingerprints still visible in Irish DNA today. And here is the key finding that explains the Black Irish phenomenon far better than any shipwreck story. The genes responsible for dark hair and dark eyes were never fully erased from the Irish gene pool. They were always there, inherited from those very first hunter-gatherers, and reinforced at different points by later migrations, including populations from the Mediterranean and continental Europe, who also carried these traits. Genetics does not work in neat categories. A gene for dark hair does not disappear just because the average population trends toward red or blonde hair over time. It sits quietly in the genetic code, sometimes recessive, sometimes hidden for generations, and then it resurfaces when 2 people who both carry that variant have children together. This is exactly the mechanism researchers found driving what people call Black Irish features today. It is not a separate bloodline. It is not proof of a hidden foreign ancestor from a shipwreck 400 years ago. It is ancient ancestry, present in the Irish population for thousands of years, occasionally expressing itself strongly enough to stand out against the more common red-haired, fair-skinned appearance that people associate with Ireland. Which raises another question. If dark features trace back to the earliest inhabitants, why does Ireland have such a strong reputation for red hair and pale skin in the first place? The answer lies in a mix of genetics and geography. Ireland has one of the highest concentrations of red hair anywhere on Earth, with estimates suggesting around 10% of the population carries red hair, and a much larger percentage carry the recessive gene without visibly expressing it. This concentration developed partly through genetic drift, the random fluctuation of gene frequencies in smaller, more isolated populations over long periods of time, and partly through natural selection favoring pale skin in a place with limited sunlight, since paler skin allows better vitamin D production in a cloudy northern climate. Over thousands of years, as Ireland's population grew more isolated on its island geography, these traits became concentrated and visible, eventually forming the image most people associate with Irish identity today. But concentration is not the same as uniformity. Just because red hair and pale skin became more common does not mean darker traits vanished. They persisted quietly in the background, passed down through families, occasionally surfacing in full when the right combination of genes lined up in a child. Researchers found this pattern repeated across specific regions of Ireland, including parts of County Galway, areas along the western coastline, and pockets of the south, regions that historically had different patterns of migration and settlement compared to the rest of the island. These regional differences in ancestry are subtle, but they are measurable, and they help explain why certain areas seem to have a higher concentration of dark-haired, dark-eyed families than others. Before we go further, it helps to understand how researchers actually gathered this data, because the process itself took years and involved far more than a single lab test. Scientists worked with museums, universities, and local communities across Ireland to collect ancient bone samples, some pulled from megalithic tombs that are older than the pyramids of Egypt, others recovered from early medieval graveyards, Viking-era settlements, and rural burial grounds that had never been genetically tested before. Extracting usable DNA from bones that are thousands of years old is delicate work. Most of the genetic material degrades over time, so researchers often had to test dozens of samples just to find a handful with enough intact DNA to sequence properly. Once they had readable genetic material, they compared it against modern DNA collected from thousands of living volunteers across every county in Ireland, along with comparison samples from Britain, France, Spain, Scandinavia, and the wider European mainland. Only after cross-referencing all of these layers, ancient bones, modern volunteers, and neighboring populations, could researchers start building an accurate picture of how Irish ancestry actually formed over time. That picture turned out to be far messier and far more fascinating than the tidy folk explanations that had been repeated for generations. It also forced researchers to confront other popular legends beyond just the Spanish Armada story. Irish mythology is full of origin tales explaining where different groups of people supposedly came from. Whole texts describe waves of mythical invaders arriving on the island, including the Firbolg, the Tuatha De Danann, and the Milesians, each said to have conquered the land before them and left behind their own bloodline. For centuries, some of these legends were treated less as myth and more as garbled folk memory of real ancient migrations, and a few historians speculated that the darker-featured Irish families might trace back to one of these specific legendary groups, rather than to Spanish sailors at all. When geneticists tested this idea, they found the same result as before. There was no evidence of a separate, distinct founding population hiding within Irish genetics that matched any of these mythological waves. What the legends most likely represent is a cultural memory of the real prehistoric migrations scientists did confirm: the hunter-gatherers, the farmers from Anatolia, and the steppe herders, dramatized and reshaped over thousands of years of oral storytelling into tales of gods, giants, and invading tribes. There's another twist in the data that surprised researchers even further. Even when they compared Irish genetic samples against broader European populations, they found that Irish DNA shares meaningful genetic overlap with populations in northern Spain and the Basque region, areas along the Atlantic coastline of the Iberian Peninsula. For a long time, this similarity got mistaken as evidence for the Spanish Armada story, since it seemed to confirm a connection between Ireland and Spain. But the real explanation is much older and has nothing to do with 16th century shipwrecks. This genetic connection traces back to the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods, when populations along the Atlantic coast of Europe, stretching from Iberia up through France and into the British Isles, shared ancestry through ancient maritime migration routes that existed thousands of years before Spain or Ireland existed as concepts. Early coastal populations moved along the Atlantic seaboard by boat, trading, migrating, and mixing over an enormous span of time. The genetic similarity between Ireland and northern Spain is a leftover signature of that ancient Atlantic coastal network, not evidence of a shipwreck that happened a few centuries ago. This finding fits into a bigger pattern that keeps showing up whenever scientists study European ancestry closely. Modern national identities like Irish, Spanish, French, or English are relatively recent cultural inventions layered on top of genetic histories that stretch back tens of thousands of years and involve constant movement, mixing, and reshuffling of populations. There was never a moment in history where a pure, isolated Irish population existed untouched by outside genetic influence. Ireland's genetic story, like every population's genetic story, is one of continuous migration and blending, not isolation and purity. Researchers also looked closely at whether the Black Irish phenomenon showed any connection to Phoenician traders, another popular folk theory. According to this version of the legend, ancient Phoenician merchants from the eastern Mediterranean sailed to Ireland thousands of years ago seeking tin and other resources, and left behind genetic traces still visible today in dark-featured Irish families. This theory has circulated for over a century, championed at various points by amateur historians and even some early anthropologists. But when geneticists tested it directly by comparing Irish DNA against known Phoenician genetic markers derived from ancient burial sites in Lebanon and former Phoenician colonies around the Mediterranean, they found no meaningful genetic signal supporting the idea. The dark features long attributed to Phoenician ancestry trace back instead to the same deep hunter-gatherer and early farming ancestry already established in Ireland long before any Phoenician ships supposedly arrived. Another romantic legend, another case where the DNA simply did not match the story. What makes all of this even more interesting is what it reveals about how folklore forms in the first place. Humans are pattern-seeking storytellers. When people noticed a visible difference within their own community, darker hair, darker eyes, a different look compared to their neighbors, they needed an explanation. And in a world without genetic science, the explanations came from the most dramatic and memorable events available: a shipwreck, foreign traders, a hidden bloodline. These stories spread because they were compelling, not because they were accurate. The real explanation, deep ancestral genetic variation persisting quietly across thousands of years, is far less exciting to tell around a fire, even though it turns out to be the true one. The genetic study of Ireland also uncovered something that challenges a much bigger assumption people carry about ethnicity in general: the idea that a national or ethnic identity corresponds neatly to a single uniform genetic profile. Ireland, despite being a relatively small island with a population that has stayed comparatively stable for centuries, shows a surprising amount of internal genetic diversity. Researchers were able to identify at least 10 distinct genetic clusters within the Irish population alone, each linked to specific regions and historical settlement patterns. People from Ulster show measurably different genetic signatures compared to people from Munster. Populations along the western coastline carry different ancestral proportions compared to populations in the east, which had more direct contact with Britain and continental Europe throughout history due to trade and invasion routes. This means that even within a single small island, genetic variation is far more complex and layered than most people assume, and the Black Irish trait is just one visible expression of that deeper complexity. The Viking and Norman chapters of Irish history added their own layers to this genetic story, and they help explain why some coastal and eastern regions of Ireland show slightly different ancestral patterns than the rural west. Starting in the late 8th century, Norse raiders began arriving on Irish shores, and what began as hit and run raids on monasteries eventually turned into permanent settlement. The Vikings founded some of Ireland's most important cities, including Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, as trading ports connected to a much wider Norse world stretching from Scandinavia to the British Isles. Genetic studies confirm that Norse ancestry is still measurable in populations from these port cities today, though it makes up a relatively small percentage of overall Irish DNA compared to the older prehistoric layers. A few centuries later, Norman invaders arrived from England and Wales, bringing yet another wave of genetic input tied to French and broader continental European ancestry. These later historical migrations added new variation into specific regions, without erasing the deep ancestral layers already present. This is part of why geneticists describe the Irish population not as one single bloodline, but as a layered genetic record, with each historical era leaving a faint but readable signature that modern DNA testing can still detect today. It's worth pausing on just how strange this makes the whole concept of a fixed ethnic identity. Ask most people what makes someone Irish, and they will describe a certain look, a certain accent, a certain set of cultural traditions. But genetically speaking, being Irish has never meant carrying one uniform set of DNA. It has always meant carrying a specific layered combination of ancestries built up over 10,000 years of migration, mixing, isolation, and remixing. The hunter-gatherer who lived on the island long before agriculture existed is just as genetically Irish as the farmer who arrived from Anatolia 6,000 years ago, who is just as genetically Irish as the Norse settler who founded Dublin, who is just as genetically Irish as a family whose most visible ancestor happens to be one of those original dark-haired, dark-eyed hunter-gatherers resurfacing generations later. There is no single authentic genetic starting point to measure everyone else against. There is only the accumulated layering of everyone who ever lived, settled, and had children on that island across thousands of years. The same pattern showed up again when researchers studied Irish diaspora communities abroad, particularly in the United States, where the term Black Irish took on an even wider and more confused meaning. Irish immigrants arriving in America during the 1800s, especially during and after the Great Famine, faced intense discrimination, and communities sometimes used physical differences within their own group to draw internal social lines. Families with darker hair and eyes were occasionally treated as somehow less authentically Irish by their own neighbors, fueling even more speculation about hidden foreign ancestry. Genetic testing of Irish American families today shows exactly what the Irish-based studies already proved. There is no separate bloodline. The variation in appearance comes from the same deep ancestral layering present across the entire historical Irish population, simply carried across the ocean along with everything else these families brought with them. There's also a medical angle to this research that turned out to matter more than expected. Certain genetic conditions and traits cluster within specific Irish regional populations because of this same ancestral layering. Understanding which ancestral group contributed, which genetic markers helps researchers trace the origins of certain hereditary conditions found at higher rates in Irish populations compared to the rest of Europe. This is not about ranking populations or suggesting any group is superior or inferior. It is simply about understanding how thousands of years of migration, isolation, and mixing shape the genetic health profile of a specific population, information that has real value for modern medicine and public health research in Ireland today. So what does all of this mean for the people who grew up hearing they were Black Irish, told stories about a Spanish ancestor or a hidden bloodline running through their family? The DNA results don't erase the identity or the family stories passed down through generations. What they do is replace one explanation with a much older and, honestly, a far more remarkable one. Instead of descending from a handful of shipwrecked sailors 400 years ago, these families carry a direct genetic thread back to the very first humans who ever set foot on the island of Ireland, 10,000 years before anyone called it Ireland at all. That is not a smaller story. It is a bigger one. It means the dark hair and dark eyes showing up in a family today are not a foreign addition to Irish identity. They are one of the oldest and most original expressions of what being Irish has genetically meant from the very beginning. Pigmentation genetics itself turned out to be a much bigger and more delicate subject than most people realize, and understanding it properly helps explain why the whole Black Irish mystery persisted for so long without a clear answer. Hair color, eye color, and skin tone are not controlled by a single gene each. They are the product of dozens of different genetic variants working together, some with strong effects, many with only tiny partial influence. A person can inherit a mix of variants from both parents that combine in ways that produce a completely different appearance than either parent individually, especially when recessive traits from several generations back happen to line up in one child. This is exactly why two siblings raised in the same household with the same parents can look strikingly different from one another, one with red hair and freckles, another with dark hair and eyes, without either of them needing a separate ancestral origin to explain it. The genetic instructions for both appearances were sitting quietly in the family's shared DNA the entire time, waiting for the right combination to appear. Researchers also pointed out that human beings are naturally drawn to pattern recognition, sometimes even when no meaningful pattern actually exists. When a family noticed a child with unusually dark features compared to relatives, the explanation reached for was rarely simple genetic variation. It was almost always something more dramatic, a secret ancestor, a foreign sailor, hidden bloodline passed down in whispers. This tendency to build dramatic stories around ordinary genetic variation is not unique to Ireland. Similar folk explanations show up across the world wherever a visible trait stands out against the regional norm, from stories about hidden Moorish ancestry in parts of Spain to legends of shipwrecked foreign sailors explaining unusual features in coastal communities, from Cornwall to Newfoundland. The Black Irish legend fits into this much larger global pattern of communities, reaching for exotic outside explanations instead of recognizing ordinary, deep-rooted genetic diversity within their own population. The wider lesson from this research reaches beyond just one island and one folk legend. Time and again, when scientists compare DNA against popular stories about ancestry, race, and ethnic identity, the genetic reality turns out to be more layered, more mixed, and more ancient than the cultural myths built to explain it. Populations we think of as fixed and uniform are almost always the product of multiple waves of migration and blending, stretching back thousands of years. Traits we assume mark someone as an outsider or a foreign addition often turn out to be some of the oldest, most deeply rooted characteristics a population carries, and explanations passed down through generations, no matter how confidently repeated, do not automatically become true just because they feel satisfying to believe. The Black Irish were never a separate people hiding within Ireland. They were never proof of a secret foreign bloodline sailing in from Spain or the Mediterranean. They were, and are, simply Irish, carrying forward genetic traits that have been part of the island's population since the very first hunter-gatherers walked its coastline. The dark secret behind Black Irish DNA turned out not to be a secret about outsiders at all. It was a secret about just how deep and how old Irish identity truly runs, hiding in plain sight the entire time, written into the genes of families who never needed a shipwreck to explain who they really were.